Some men go quiet after loss. And some men go so quiet, the world forgets they're still there.
He built that house for her. Every window. Every wall. Then something arrived in Milhaven. Something he wasn't ready for.
But sometimes, what you build finds you first.
The rocking chair sat in the corner by the window, covered in a length of white cotton cloth. It had sat that way for 3 years. The cloth had yellowed slightly at the edges where the afternoon sun touched it, but Kale Merritt kept it clean. He shook it out every Sunday. He folded it back precisely, smoothing the corners with the flat of his palm. He did this without thinking, the way a man tends a grave. He never sat in the chair. He never moved it. He only looked at it sometimes in the evenings when the lamp was low and the cabin had settled into its nighttime silence. He would stand in the middle of the room with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and he would look at the shape beneath the cloth. The way the armrests pushed up against the fabric, the way the curved back made a gentle hill in the white cotton. It was just a chair of pine and patience, nothing remarkable about it to any eye but his. But it was the heaviest object in the world, and every room he had ever stood in since the autumn of 1881 had been organized around the fact of it. Outside, Milhaven, Wyoming was doing what it always did in the deep hours before dawn, settling, contracting in the cold. The boards of the livery 2 streets over groaned against the frost. A dog somewhere on the far edge of town sent up a single mournful note and then thought better of it. The sage flats beyond the cabin stretched out in the darkness, limitless and indifferent, the kind of land that did not care whether a man lived well or poorly, whether he grieved or celebrated, whether he spoke or stayed silent for years at a time. Kale Merritt had been silent for a long time. He set the cold coffee down on the table beside him, careful not to make noise, as though the quiet were something that could be disturbed and broken. He looked at the chair one moment longer. Then he turned, took his coat from the peg by the door, and went out into the dark to begin his day. He was 32 years old, and he moved like a man considerably older, not slow, not infirm, just deliberate, every step placed with a kind of grim economy, as though he had measured out the precise number of movements allotted to him and intended not to waste a single one. He walked the mile into town in the dark with his collar up and his eyes on the road ahead. He did not look at the churchyard on the eastern edge of town as he passed it. He had not looked at it in 14 months. He knew exactly where it was. He knew the exact distance from the iron gate to the far corner where the Cottonwood stood. He knew it the way you knew the dimensions of a room you had spent a long time inside. He had built it for Rose. He had built the cabin too, with his own hands 2 summers before she died. They had stood together in the sage, he and Rose, on an afternoon in June, when the light was long and the mountains were still holding their snow at the peaks, and she had pointed to where she wanted the kitchen window so she could see those mountains when she washed the dishes in the morning. He had set that window himself, leveled it twice, made certain the view was exactly right. He had been 28 years old and had believed, with a completeness he could not now imagine, that he was building the permanent architecture of his life. That the window and the mountains and Rose's face in the morning light were things that would simply continue the way the mountains continued. Solid and reliable beyond any reasonable question. The child had come early. Rose had not survived the night. The baby, a boy, had lived for 4 hours. Kale had buried them in the same plot, which had seemed right at the time and still seemed right now, though the rightness of it was a thing that lived in his chest like a stone, smooth and permanent and cold. A weight he had stopped noticing only because you stopped noticing the things you carried long enough. He arrived at the livery before the stable boys, as he always did. He lit the first lamp, hung it on its hook, and began his rounds. He checked each horse in turn, speaking to them in a low, continuous murmur that was not quite words. A sound of presence, a sound of reassurance. The horses knew him. They turned their heads when he entered, ears swiveling forward, their breathing easing in a way that was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look. He had a gift with horses that he had never been able to explain and had long since stopped trying to. He simply understood them. They were creatures of sensation and memory, of fear and trust, and he spoke a language they recognized without either of them having to name it. The rangy bay gelding in the third stall was the newest arrival, brought in 2 weeks ago from a failed homestead out near the Bitter Creek. He had a wild look that some men would have called mean, but Kale recognized it for what it was. Terror, wearing the mask of aggression. He stood outside the stall for a full minute, not moving, not speaking, just letting the horse feel his presence and decide what it meant. The horse watched him with one rolling, white-rimmed eye. Kale waited. After a time, the horse dropped his head an inch. A small thing, an enormous thing. Kale went in. This was how his days were built, piece by piece, horse by horse, task by careful task. He worked from the first gray light until the lamps came on in the saloon, and then he walked home. He bought his supplies at Henderson's general store on Thursdays. He paid his tab at the end of each month. He nodded to the men he worked alongside without particular warmth or coldness, simply acknowledgement, the bare minimum of social recognition required to keep a working life functional. They had stopped trying to pull him into conversation in the first year. By the second year, his solitude had become an established fact of Milhaven, like the reliability of the northern wind or the quality of the water from the eastern well. Men did not reach toward things that had made it clear they did not want to be reached toward. He had made it very clear. The afternoon stage came in on a Thursday in the first week of October 1884. Kale was at Henderson's when it arrived, standing at the counter with 4 items laid out in a precise line: flour, coffee, a slab of salt pork, a box of cartridges. He was counting out exact change when the sound of the stage rattled through the street outside, and he did not look up. He was on his way out when the door opened and nearly caught him. He stepped back. The woman who came through was carrying a large travel bag and managing it with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned not to expect help and had adjusted her grip accordingly. She pulled up short when she saw him, and for a half second they stood in the doorway together, him going out, her coming in. She had brown hair pinned up practically under a gray traveling bonnet. Her eyes, which he registered in the brief and automatic way he registered most things, were a clear, steady brown, the color of good creek water in summer. She was young, 20 perhaps, or a few years past it. There was a quality of composed attention in her face, as though she were not just looking at the space around her, but actually taking it in and filing it away for later use. She stepped to one side. He stepped to the other. He went out. He did not think about her again that day. The town, however, thought about her considerably. By Friday morning, Milhaven had established that her name was Norah Voss, that she had come from Cheyenne by way of Laramie, that she carried a letter of reference from a dressmaker in Cheyenne of apparently good reputation, and that she had negotiated the lease on the empty storefront that had previously housed the late barber's shop, with a directness that had left the building's owner, the generally immovable Mr. Aldous Crane, somewhat surprised to find himself agreeing to terms favorable to the tenant. She spent the first 3 days cleaning the storefront. Kale walked past it each morning on his way to the livery and observed the progress with the kind of peripheral attention he gave most things in town. A general awareness that something was changing in a given location, filed and set aside. The first morning the windows were gray with old dust. The second morning they had been washed until they caught the weak October sun and threw it back in clean rectangles on the board sidewalk. The third morning a small handwritten sign appeared in the lower corner of the right window: N. Voss, dressmaking and mending. Est, October 1884. It was neat lettering. Even and unhurried, each letter given its full measure of space. He noted it and kept walking. He saw her properly for the first time on the following Monday. He was working with the bay gelding in the corral beside the livery, the horse still skittish, still prone to that sideways slide of the hindquarters that meant the trust was not yet solid enough to hold under pressure. Kale was not fighting him. He never fought them. He moved with the horse, matching its energy and slowly redirecting it. A conversation conducted entirely through weight and stillness and the precise angle of a shoulder turned away or toward. He was so absorbed in the work that he did not hear her approach the fence. He became aware of her the way he became aware of most things that were not the task directly in front of him. Not through sight or sound, but through a change in the quality of the air around him. Some subtle shift, or the particular way the bay's ear flicked once to the left and then came carefully back to him. He glanced toward the fence. She was standing on the lower rail with her arms folded over the top, watching with the same composed attention he had registered in the doorway of Henderson's. She was not watching him. She was watching the horse. There was a distinction there that he noticed without being entirely sure why it registered as a distinction worth noting. He turned back to the gelding. He finished the work, brought the horse to a standing quiet at the center of the corral, stood beside him with one hand on his neck until the animal's breathing had completely settled. This took 12 minutes. He was aware, at the periphery of his attention, that the woman at the fence did not move or speak during all of that time. She simply watched with the patient stillness of someone who understood that what she was observing required the time it was taking. When he finally walked the horse back to the stall and came back out, she was gone. He encountered her again that Thursday at Henderson's. She was at the fabric end of the counter, examining a bolt of dark wool with the focused professional attention of someone assessing a specific quality rather than a general aesthetic. She ran her thumb along the selvage edge. She held a corner up to the window light. She set it down and made a small note in a pocket ledger she produced from her coat. Henderson was watching her with the expression of a man who has realized he is dealing with a customer who knows exactly what she is looking at and cannot be easily redirected. Kale laid out his items: flour, coffee, cartridges. He counted his change. He was at the door when she said, without looking up from the bolt of wool, "That bay gelding. He's going to be something once he settles." Kale stopped. He had not been addressed directly by a stranger in long enough that the experience required a brief moment of adjustment. He turned slightly. She was still examining the wool, her attention apparently entirely on the fabric. "He's got good bone," Kale said. The words came out rougher than he intended, from disuse. She looked up then, and he saw again that quality of direct, undemanding attention. She was not trying to make conversation in the social sense. She was simply stating an observation and receiving the response. "He does," she said and returned to her ledger. Kale went out. He thought about the exchange later that evening, standing in his cabin with a plate of beans and salt pork going cold on the table. This was unusual. He did not generally think about exchanges with people he barely knew. He catalogued them and moved on. There was something about her manner that sat differently from what he was accustomed to. She had offered an observation about the horse without making it an opening for further conversation, without requiring him to match her socially or reward her attention with warmth he did not have. She had simply said the accurate thing and let it stand. He ate his dinner. He looked at the chair. He went to bed. 3 days later, she came to the livery. He was replacing a cracked trace on a set of driving harness when he heard her step in the doorway. He did not look up immediately. He finished the splice he was working on, pressed the leather flat with his thumb, and then straightened. She was carrying a heavy wool blanket over one arm, the kind of serious full-weight blanket that a person living in Wyoming did not own without reason. She held it with the easy confidence of someone carrying a working object. "Mr. Merritt," she said. Her voice was even. Not apologetic, not over-bright, with the effort of being pleasant to a man who had given her no reason to be. He waited. "I was hoping you might be able to put a new binding on this. The edge has come apart." She held up the corner of the blanket so he could see the frayed seam where the leather had pulled away from the wool. "I'd take it to the saddle shop, but I've seen your stitch work on the driving harnesses. It's more even." He looked at the blanket. He looked at her. He was aware that this was a pretext. The saddle shop did perfectly adequate binding work, and a woman who had examined a bolt of wool the way she had examined that bolt of wool on Thursday would know the difference between adequate and something better. She was finding a reason to have a transaction with him, and she was doing it without pretending otherwise, which was different from what he expected and harder to dismiss. He knew it. She knew he knew it. He took the blanket from her. His calloused fingers met hers for a fraction of a second at the handoff, the accidental contact of ordinary commerce. He examined the binding. The stitching had pulled away along about 6 inches of one edge. He turned the blanket over. The wool was good quality, tight weave, well cared for. "Leave it," he said, and turned back to the harness. She left it on a clean section of the workbench and walked out into the thin October sun without another word. He finished the harness trace. He started work on a broken stirrup leather. He did not think about the blanket or about the woman who had left it. He thought about the bay gelding who had accepted a halter that morning for the first time without resistance. He thought about the coming winter and whether the north wall of the livery needed additional chinking before the hard cold settled in. He repaired the blanket's binding that evening after the stable boys had gone home and the livery was quiet. He used a good grade of leather cord, finer than the original binding had been. He stitched it with an even tight cross-stitch that would outlast the blanket itself. When he was done, he looked at it for a moment. Then he added a second line of stitching along the inside edge, a reinforcement that no one had asked for, and that would not be visible from the outside unless you looked for it specifically. He folded the blanket neatly and left it on the workbench. He was halfway home before he registered that he had added the second line. He did not go back. He kept walking and filed the fact away in the category of things he was not going to spend time on. She came back a week later. He was reshoeing a draft horse, the air of the livery sharp with hot iron and scorched hoof, and he was bent over the animal's left rear leg with a rasp when he heard her step. He finished the work he was doing before straightening. He set the hoof down, stood up, and turned. She was holding a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. The blanket was already gone. She had collected it at some point during the morning when he had been out in the corral. He had not seen her come or go. "I wanted to pay for the mending," she said. "No charge. I brought you something anyway." She set the parcel on the flat of the anvil. "It's bread I baked this morning." He looked at the parcel, then he looked at her. No one had brought him food in 3 years. The last person who had left food on his workbench had been Ida Lander, the preacher's wife, in the first weeks after Rose died, when the town was still in the early uncertain phase of not knowing what to do with a man who had lost everything at once. He had thanked her and eaten the food, and by the time the casseroles and the preserves had stopped coming, he had been relieved. He had not wanted anyone's food. He had not wanted the obligation of gratitude that came with it, the implication that he was a man in need of tending. He did not want it now, either. "Don't need it," he said. His voice came out flat and final, the tone he used when a transaction was concluded and there was nothing further to discuss. Norah Voss looked at him. Her expression did not shift toward apology or retreat. It remained simply present, the way she was simply present, in the quiet way she seemed to occupy space without requiring it to accommodate her. "Everyone needs bread," she said, gently, without argument or pressure, simply as a statement of fact that she was willing to leave standing on its own. She gave a small nod and walked out of the livery and into the thin, hard sunlight of the October afternoon. Kale stood in the middle of the livery floor. The draft horse shifted its weight behind him, a vast, patient sound. He stared at the brown paper parcel on the anvil. He should have left it for the stable boys, who would have eaten it without questions and been grateful. He was aware of every reason to do exactly that. He left it on the anvil when he walked home that evening. He was 20 yards down the street in the cold that was settling hard from the north before he stopped. He stood there for a moment in the dark. Then he went back, picked up the parcel, and walked home with it under his arm, the paper still faintly warm from the residual heat of the forge. Inside the cabin, in the yellow circle of the lamp, he unwrapped it. It was a sourdough loaf. The crust was deep brown and perfectly even, the kind of crust that came from a confident hand in an oven someone knew how to read. The smell that came off it when he broke the heel open filled the small room in a way that stopped him where he stood. It was the smell of a warm kitchen, of bread proving on a cold morning, of someone having stood at a stove with floury hands and the plain, unhurried intention of making something good. It did not belong in this cabin. Nothing warm belonged here. He had made it that way on purpose. He ate the bread standing at the cold hearth, tearing pieces off with his hands and chewing them slowly, because it was good bread and because he was hungry in a way he had not allowed himself to notice until this moment. He ate half the loaf. He wrapped the rest carefully and left it on the table. He lay on his back in the dark that night and looked at the ceiling and tried to think about nothing, which was what he did in the hours when sleep would not come. The smell of the bread was still in the room. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. His mind kept finding it and turning away and finding it again, the way your tongue finds a loose tooth. He did not know what to do with a room that smelled like someone had been in it. In the days that followed, she found other reasons. A leather strap on a satchel she was using to carry fabric samples had pulled loose from its buckle, and she thought a liveryman might have the right weight of rivets to fix it. She had heard that the best waterproofing for canvas involved a specific mixture of pine tar and tallow, and wondered if he had worked with it. These were not elaborate pretexts. They were the practical currency of a person who moved through the world by finding genuine points of connection rather than manufacturing them from nothing. And the fact that she happened to have genuine questions for a horse trainer and leather worker was perhaps not entirely coincidental. He answered her questions with the minimum of words required to be accurate. He fixed the strap. He described the waterproofing mixture in one sentence. She left things: a jar of apple preserves from the first shipment Henderson's had received that fall. A few newspapers she said she had already read and thought he might want. She left them without ceremony, without waiting to see his reaction, setting them on the workbench or the anvil, and then redirecting her attention immediately elsewhere, as though the act of leaving them was already complete, and she had no further interest in how they were received. He noticed that she never looked back as she walked away. He began to look for her without deciding to. It started as something he was barely conscious of, a peripheral scan of the street as he walked into town in the mornings, a slight automatic assessment of which lights were burning in which buildings as he walked home in the evenings. He caught himself one Wednesday afternoon taking the longer route from the grain merchant back to the livery, the way that happened to pass the front window of N. Voss, dressmaking and mending, where the lamplight was already burning against the early dark of October's end. He pulled up short in the middle of the street. He stood there for a moment, the cold settling around him, and felt something move through him that had nothing to do with the weather. He turned around and took the direct route back. He walked it at a pace that did not invite reflection. He sat in his cabin that night with the cold coffee and the low lamp and the white draped chair in its corner, and he felt the familiar shape of his grief the way a man feels the walls of a room in the dark, touching each surface to confirm it is still there, still solid, still defining the boundaries of the space he occupies. Rose had sat in that chair every evening. She had mended by lamplight, her hands moving with the quick practical intelligence he could now see in Norah Voss's hands when she examined fabric or worked a knot. He had sat across from her with a piece of harness or a whittling project, and they had talked or they had not talked, and either way had been entirely right. That quality of companionable silence, of being in the same room with another person and not requiring the room to produce anything beyond the fact of the two of them in it, had been the thing he had not known was extraordinary until it was gone. He had been trying to recreate it in the only way available to him, by engineering its absence. By making the cabin so silent, so stripped of any presence other than his own, that the silence itself became a kind of company, a stand-in. A monument to the original. He recognized this thought and stepped back from it the way you step back from the edge of something in the dark. You did not need to see the bottom to know it was there. He went to bed. November arrived with a hard north wind that stripped the last cottonwood leaves from the creek bottom and laid them flat on the frozen ground. The sky went white and stayed white. Kale brought extra straw into the stalls and spent 2 evenings in the cold chinking the north wall of the livery, filling the gaps with methodical thoroughness because physical problems had solutions that stayed solved, which was more than could be said for most things. It was on a Thursday in the second week of November that she brought him the shirt. She appeared at the livery in the early afternoon with his work shirt folded over her arm, the brown broadcloth shirt he had left with her 10 days earlier with a torn cuff. She had offered to mend it when she noticed the tear, and he had let her take it because refusing would have required more words than compliance. She held it out to him. The cuff had been repaired with stitches so small, and even that the mend was nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. She had taken the time to find an exact thread match, not something close but exact, which was the kind of care that went beyond what the transaction required. He took the shirt. He looked at the cuff. He looked at her. She was not looking at him. She had turned slightly toward the bay gelding, who was hanging his head over the half-door of his stall with the tentative, hopeful expression of a horse who has recently decided that people might be acceptable after all. "He's different," she said. "He's getting there." A pause. Not uncomfortable. The quality of silence that exists between two people who do not feel required to fill it. "How long does it take?" she asked. With a horse like that, one that's been frightened badly. He considered the question as he would consider any practical question put to him. "Depends on the horse. Depends on who's doing the work." He paused. "You can't rush it. You rush it, and you set the whole thing back further than where you started." She nodded, still watching the gelding. There was something in the quality of her attention that suggested the question had not been entirely about horses. The afternoon light was flattening toward gray. The wind was picking up outside, sending a thin skirl of dust across the livery floor from the open end. Kale became aware, in the sudden, complete way he sometimes became aware of things he would have preferred not to, that he did not want her to leave. The awareness arrived without warning, and the shock of it was nearly physical, like stepping through ice that you had believed was solid. He said nothing. She turned from the horse and looked at him directly. "Why do you keep finding reasons to come here?" he asked. He had not planned to say it. The words came out flat and unadorned, just the question itself. She considered it without taking offense, the way she considered everything. "You looked like you could use some company," she said. 3 years. 3 years of building something precise and impenetrable, and she had walked up to it, looked at it for a few weeks, and said the true thing about it in 7 words. He felt those words move through him like a cold wire pulled tight, exact and unavoidable. She had not said it with pity. She had not said it with the particular brand of well-meaning pressure that people used when they wanted to fix something that was not theirs to fix. She had simply named what she saw. Something hot rose in his chest. Anger, or the thing that wore anger's face when the actual feeling underneath was more difficult to look at directly. "I have all the company I need," he said. His voice came out level and cold, and he turned and walked toward the rear of the livery with the deliberateness of a man ending a conversation by the simple act of no longer being in it. He heard her footsteps cross the floor. He heard the sound of a person stepping from wood to frozen ground. Then nothing. He stood at the gate of the bay's stall. The horse put his nose against his palm and breathed there, warm and steady, that small particular trust that had taken months to build. Kale stood like that for a long time. He told himself the feeling in his chest was irritation, at her persistence, at the way she had walked up to something he had constructed with considerable effort and said the accurate thing about it, without appearing to understand the full weight of what she had done. But the irritation did not feel like irritation when he examined it honestly, and he was a man who, when he examined things, examined them honestly even when he would have preferred not to. That evening he walked past the churchyard on the way home. He had not done this in over a year. He did not stop. He kept his eyes on the road, but he was aware of it beside him in the dark, the low iron fence, the pale shapes of the markers, the small plot in the far corner where the cottonwood stood bare. He kept walking. In his cabin, he lit the lamp. The white-draped chair sat in its corner. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment in the particular stillness that preceded a decision he had not yet made. He sat down at the workbench and picked up the piece of cottonwood he had been returning to, on and off, for the past several weeks. He did not remember the exact evening he had started it. He had simply found himself one night with a knife in one hand and a block of pale wood in the other, his hands moving in the old instinctive way they had when they needed something to do, while the rest of him was occupied with things he could not work directly. The shape that had emerged from the wood over those weeks was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. A horse, rendered in clean economic lines, the grain of the wood flowing with the imagined curve of the animal's neck. A mare with a gentle, alert quality to her posture, the kind of horse that stood still because she chose to, not because she had been trained into stillness. He turned it over in his hands in the lamplight. He set it down and looked at the chair. Then he went out into the yard and stood in the cold for a long time, looking up at the Wyoming sky, which was doing what it always did in November, being enormous and indifferent and burning with an impossible density of stars. He stood there until the cold had worked all the way through his coat and into his shoulders. Then he went back inside. On the south edge of town, in the storefront with the clean windows and the even handwritten sign, a lamp burned well past the hour when most of Milhaven had gone dark. Norah Voss sat at her cutting table in the pool of yellow light, her hands still in her lap, looking at nothing in particular. This was not her habit. She was not a woman who sat with idle hands. She worked in the evenings as she worked in the days, with a focused, unhurried application that had nothing driven or anxious about it, simply the steady practice of a person who understood that everything worth having was built from accumulated small efforts. But tonight she was sitting still. She had been thinking about what she had said in the livery, and about how he had turned his back, and about the quality of the silence he had left behind when he walked away. Not the silence of a man who did not care. Something else entirely. He had been around enough quiet people to know the difference between a man who had nothing to say and a man who was carrying something so large that words had stopped being adequate for it a long time ago. She had pushed. She had not planned to push quite that directly, but she had, and she was sitting with the result of it now, which was uncertain territory. Outside, the November wind moved through the street with the first real authority of the coming winter. The town was settling for the night around her, shutters pulled, fires banked, people drawing inward the way people drew inward in this country when the cold made its intentions clear. She sat in her quiet shop and thought about patience and what it required and what it was worth, and after a long while she picked up her shears and returned to the length of wool waiting on the cutting table. The morning after their exchange in the livery, Kale arrived at the livery an hour earlier than usual. He was awake at 4 with no prospect of sleep and a restlessness that had no productive outlet in a dark cabin, so he dressed and walked into town in the black cold and began his rounds. He worked through the morning with his usual focused intensity, but the concentration had gaps in it, small ones. He would be in the middle of examining a horse's leg or working a knot out of a lead rope, and his mind would slip sideways without permission and land somewhere he had not sent it. He would find himself replaying her voice with an accuracy he had not asked for. You looked like you could use some company. Not accusing, not pitying. The way the temperature outside was simply the temperature outside. A thing stated because it was so, not because stating it was meant to accomplish something beyond the stating. This was what he could not get purchase on. Every other person in Milhaven who had ever attempted to reach him had wanted something from the reaching. The satisfaction of having helped, or the ease of his social participation, or the reassurance that a grieving man was recovering according to a recognizable schedule. Norah Voss appeared to want nothing except to leave accurate observations in his vicinity and then remove herself, which was an approach he had no established defense against. By mid-morning the stable boys had arrived, and Kale put himself to work on the bay gelding. He took the horse out into the corral in the gray November light and worked him on the lunge line, reading the animal's responses with his full attention. The gelding was better. The wild-eyed sideways skitter had reduced to an occasional ear-flattening that was more habit than genuine fear now. The trust was building, slow and sure, the way it always built when you gave it the time it required and did not try to hurry it past its natural pace. He was bringing the horse back to the gate when he became aware of footsteps behind him, heavier than Norah's, with the cadence of a man who walked like the ground was his by title. He turned. Gideon Price was leaning against the corral fence with his arms folded on the top rail, watching the gelding with what appeared to be genuine appraisal. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been handsome in youth and had settled in its late 30s into something more complex, more authority-laden. He had a full dark beard trimmed close, and he wore his coat the way men with money wore coats in Wyoming, which was to say it was a very good coat worn without any awareness of this fact, which meant he had owned good coats long enough not to notice them. Gideon Price ran the largest cattle operation in the Milhaven Valley. He had been doing so for 15 years. He had done it alone for the last 2, since his wife Eleanor had died of fever in the winter of 1882. He was not a man Kale disliked. He was simply a man Kale had no particular reason to interact with, which covered most men in Milhaven. "That bay yours?" Price asked. "Liveries. Where'd he come from?" "Bitter Creek Homestead. Failed out last spring." Price nodded, still studying the horse with the eye of a man who had spent a long time assessing animals. "He's going to be worth something when you're done with him. That's the idea." A pause. Price was not a man who filled silences with sound for the sake of filling them, which was perhaps why Kale had never actively avoided him the way he avoided most people's conversational attempts. Price seemed to understand that words were tools rather than social currency. "You do good work," Price said. A statement, not a compliment-seeking acknowledgement. Kale gave a short nod and led the gelding back toward the stable. The encounter itself was unremarkable. What was less unremarkable was the piece of information it surfaced. A piece of information that had been handed to him at the grain merchant's 3 days earlier, and filed without particular attention at the time. Gideon Price had been seen at Norah Voss's shop twice in the past week. The first time was straightforward commerce. He had a vest that needed work done before the winter social at the Alderman's in early December. That was a transaction. The second time had no stated purpose. He had simply stopped in, which was a different kind of visit. And this was the information that now surfaced in the back of Kale's awareness, as he cooled the bay gelding and tried to keep his attention on the legitimate demands of his afternoon. He let it go. He tried. 3 days later, he was walking back from the grain merchant in the late afternoon. He had taken the direct route, the west side of the main street, the shorter way. He had not thought about the route. He had simply walked, and he was halfway down the block before he registered that he had in fact taken the longer way around without noticing the choice being made. The lamplight was already burning in Norah's window against the early dark. He could see the clean glass catching it, throwing amber light out onto the gray November street. He kept his pace even and his eyes ahead. The door of the shop was open 6 inches. Through the gap he heard voices. Price's voice low and easy, holding the relaxed confidence of a man accustomed to rooms where his presence was welcome. And Nora's voice, a half-note lighter than her usual register, the voice of someone engaged in a conversation they were finding genuinely worth having. Kale kept walking. He ate his dinner that evening without tasting it. He sat in his cabin with the lamp turned low and the chair in its corner, under its white cloth, and he went through the list of tasks for the following day with the methodical care he brought to all inventories. And somewhere in the middle of this process he became aware that he had listed the same task twice, and had not caught it until the third time through. He set the list down. He was not jealous. He told himself this clearly. Jealousy required a prior claim, and he had no prior claim on Norah Voss. He had repaired her blanket and rejected her bread and been cold to her in his own livery. He had no standing to feel anything particular about who stood in her doorway and found her conversation worth having. What he felt, when he was honest about it, was the discomfort of a man who has let something he was not paying attention to become something that mattered to him, and who is now confronted with the evidence of this at a moment when he is not prepared for it. He went to bed. He was awake before the alarm he had not set. He threw himself into the next day's work with a physical intensity that he recognized, even as he was doing it, as misdirection. He was not short-tempered with the stable boys, because he was not a man who misdirected his interior weather at people who had nothing to do with it, but he worked at a pace that left no room for anything but the work itself, and by afternoon he was genuinely exhausted, which was what he had wanted. It was in this state, focused on wrapping a foreleg that had shown mild swelling, that he heard her step in the livery. He knew it immediately. He had not realized until this moment that he had catalogued the specific sound of it well enough to distinguish it from everyone else who came and went. This was information he received without pleasure. He finished wrapping the leg before he straightened. She was carrying a small coil of dark braided hemp rope, the kind used for rigging light loads. "I need to hang my larger bolts of fabric from the ceiling," she said. "I don't have the floor space for a standing rack. I thought you might know the right kind of knot. One that holds a fixed weight but can be released and adjusted." It was a genuine question. He could tell the genuine ones. "Trucker's hitch," he said. "If you need to tension it and adjust it, both." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know that one." A pause. He was aware of what the moment called for, the ordinary social extension of "I can show you" or "come back Thursday." He was also aware that making that extension would constitute a change, small but real, in the nature of what existed between them. He looked at the rope in her hands. "Bring it over here," he said, and moved to the workbench. He showed her the trucker's hitch slowly, naming each step in the precise flat language he used when explaining things to someone who needed to be able to replicate them. Then he untied it and handed her the rope. She tied it herself correctly on the second attempt. Her hands were quick and exact. She did not pretend to understand what she did not understand, and she did not pretend to need instruction she didn't need. They were standing close together at the workbench, closer than they generally stood. He registered this in the way he registered everything, not immediately, and then all at once. "Kale," she said, and stopped. He looked at her. It was the first time she had used his given name. She had been careful, Mr. Merritt, when address was necessary, or no name at all. The sound of his own name in her voice was something he was not prepared for. It landed somewhere below his sternum with a force that had nothing to do with the volume at which it had been spoken. She was looking at him with that unwavering attention, and in it he could see that she had assembled something she had decided to say and was going to say it. "You looked like you could use some company," she said again, the same sentence. But this time she was looking directly at him, saying it a second time on purpose, saying it because she wanted it to arrive somewhere it had perhaps deflected from the first time. He felt the same wire of panic and anger and something without a clean name pull tight in his chest. "You said that before," he said. His voice was controlled. He was controlling it with effort. "I know. I said it because it's true, and I think you know it's true." The livery was quiet around them. A horse shifted in the middle stalls. The afternoon light came through the high windows, flat and gray, the functional light of a working hour that had no warmth to offer. "What I know," he said, and stopped and began again. "What I know is that I have built something here, a way of living. It works. It is sufficient." "I know it's sufficient," she said, and she did not step back from this, did not soften it into agreement. "That's not the same thing as being well." He put the rope down on the workbench. He turned and walked toward the rear of the livery, not running, not in anger exactly, just removing himself from the proximity of what she had said and what it was doing to the structure he had spent 3 years maintaining. He heard her cross the floor. He heard her step outside. He stood at the gate of the bay's stall with his hand on the wood and the horse's warm breath against his palm, and he held himself very still. She had not said anything that was not true. That was the specific quality of the problem. She had taken the thing he had built and looked at it without judgment and named it accurately, and the name she had given it was not memorial or tribute or even grief. The name was Wall, and from the inside a wall looked exactly like home. He went back to the cabin that evening and sat at the workbench and picked up the small carved horse. He looked at it with a different attention than he had given it before, trying to see it as an outside eye would see it. What his hands had made without instruction, over weeks of evenings in the lamplight, was something that looked like the sorrel mare that Norah had watched in the corral the afternoon she had first come to the livery. The mare with the alert, self-possessed posture. The one Norah had watched with that particular quality of still attention she brought to things she found worth looking at. His hands had been making something for her without telling him. He set it down. He looked at the chair. He sat in the lamplight, and he thought about Rose, carefully and completely. He thought about her hands, which had been quick and always moving. He thought about her laugh, which had been loud and entirely unworried about whether it was becoming. He thought about the way she had turned to him in the evenings when she had just thought of something she wanted to tell him, and the particular quality of her face in those moments. He thought about the fact that she was gone, that she had been gone for 3 years, that the 3 years had passed and were going to keep passing, every one of them, regardless of what he did with them. He had believed, with a conviction that had felt like principle, that remaining inside the grief was the same as honoring her, that the silence was fidelity, that refusing comfort was tribute. He had built the wall and called it a memorial and lived inside it and called it living, but she would not have wanted this. He had always known this, at the level where things were known before they become thoughts. Rose had been a woman of enormous appetite for the ordinary daily presence of other people. She would have been furious with his silence, gently at first and then honestly impatient, and then she would have taken him by the hand and walked him out into the sunlight because that was the kind of woman she had been. She could not do that anymore. He sat with this for a long time without reaching for the wall. By the end of November, the decision had formed without his being aware of its forming, the way some decisions did. A cattle drive was organizing out of the Beckett operation, pushing a late herd north toward the Montana railhead before the passes closed for winter. Beckett had been looking for experienced hands, and the word had made its way around the livery as such words did. Kale was not a drover by trade, but he had done trail work in his 20s and knew what it required. More to the point, he knew what it would require of him to be several hundred miles from Milhaven for several weeks, and this was the actual requirement he was trying to meet. He told himself it was practical. He did not examine the telling too carefully. He spent 3 evenings not carving and not sleeping well, and looking at the white-draped chair. Then on the first day of December, he went to see Beckett and signed on for the drive. He began packing his saddlebags on a Sunday morning in the second week of December with the efficiency of a man who had done this before. Slicker, bedroll, coffee pot, skillet, 2 changes of work clothes, cartridges, his good rope. His tack was already in order because his tack was always in order. He worked through the cabin with the focused blankness he brought to tasks he did not want to examine while performing them, and he was nearly finished when he stopped at the workbench and stood there looking at the small carved horse. He picked it up. He stood in the middle of the cabin holding it. The pale cottonwood had deepened slightly from weeks of handling, warmed by his hands into something richer than the original raw wood. The grain ran through the neck in a way that made the animal look alive and in motion, even standing still. He had made this without intending to. He had made it for no purpose, he had acknowledged, but he understood its purpose now. Standing here with his saddlebags packed and the cabin stripped down to its essentials. He was going to leave, and he wanted to leave something. Not an explanation, because he did not have one that would hold. Not an apology, because naming what he was apologizing for would require understanding it more completely than he currently did. Just something. A piece of evidence that he had been here and had paid attention and had in his clumsy retreating way noticed her. It was still dark when he rode out. The sky was a deep cold black with the particular hard clarity of Wyoming in December, every star separate and burning. He rode at a walk through the sleeping town, his horse's hooves muffled on the frozen ground. He stopped at the front of her shop. The main window was closed against the cold, but she had mentioned once, without making anything of it, that she left the side casement open a crack at night because the sealed winter smell of lamp oil and fabric made the room feel airless. He tied his horse and stepped to the side of the building. The casement was open 2 inches. He could feel the faint warmth of the interior against his fingers in the cold. He set the small carved horse on the inside sill, just past the gap, standing it so it faced into the room, toward the warmth, the way a real horse would stand. He went back to his horse without looking at the window again. He rode north out of Milhaven in the dark, the town falling away behind him with the silence of a place that is asleep and does not know it is being left. Norah found it at dawn. She came downstairs in the early gray light to bank the stove before her workday began, and when she crossed to crack the side casement open for the brief morning airing she always gave the room, her hand met something on the inside sill. She picked it up. She stood in the cold morning light holding the small horse, turning it in her fingers. She did not need to wonder who had left it. She knew immediately and completely, in the way you knew certain things that were understood before they were thought. She ran her thumb along the smooth curve of the neck, along the grain of the wood, along the clean, careful lines of the work. He had made this, over weeks of evenings, with patience and attention that were impossible to miss in the finished thing, and he had left it without explanation, without his name, without any of the social scaffolding that would have made it a communication instead of simply a presence. But he had left it. She stood there for a long time in the cold of the December morning. A man who was truly finished with things, she thought. A man who had genuinely decided that the wall was sufficient and the world could stay on the other side of it, would not have spent weeks of evenings making this. A man who wanted to be forgotten did not leave something this carefully made on a windowsill in the dark. She crossed to the shelving above her cutting table and placed the small horse at the front of the highest shelf, where she could see it from anywhere in the room. She positioned it facing outward the way he had left it facing in. She stood back and looked at it for a moment. Then she went to bank the stove and begin her day. By mid-morning, the town knew that Kale Merritt had taken trail work with the Beckett drive heading north to Montana. By afternoon, the interpretations were circulating. He had gone for the money. He had gone because he could not stay still. He had gone because something had finally gotten through that wall of his, and he had done what men like him did when that happened, which was to put several hundred miles between themselves and the source of the disturbance. Norah heard all of it through the ordinary channels of a shop where people came to have their clothes mended and stayed to report on the condition of the world. She listened without comment and returned her attention to her work, and if anyone noticed the small carved horse on the shelf above her cutting table and wondered at it, they had the sense not to say so to her face. What she was not entirely prepared for was Gideon Price. He came in on a Wednesday afternoon 3 days after Kale had left, with the stated purpose of commissioning dress shirts for the Christmas social season. He sat in the chair she kept for consulting customers and conducted the business portion of the visit with the direct efficiency of a man who was accustomed to specifying what he wanted and paying for it without negotiation. She took his measurements and preferences and deposit without fuss. He did not leave immediately when the business concluded. He sat in the chair for a moment, and she was aware, without anything being said, that he was assembling something he had decided to say. "Miss Voss," he said, "I'll ask you directly, because I think directness is more respectful than the alternative." She set down her measuring tape and looked at him. "I have been a widower for 2 years," he said. "I have managed the practical side of that adequately. The other side, less so." He chose his words the way a man chose tools, picking the right one for the specific work. "I would like to call on you properly if you're willing to consider it. I don't need an answer today, but I wanted to put the question to you honestly rather than conduct an approach you might not be aware of." She looked at him. He was not a man she disliked. He was straightforward and serious, showed no evidence of wanting to be managed or managed around. She understood clearly why he was what he was in this valley. "I appreciate the directness," she said. "I'm not in a position to give you a clear answer at the moment. I need time to understand my own situation." He nodded. This did not appear to disappoint him in any visible way. "That's a fair answer," he said, stood, picked up his hat. "I'll be patient." He left. She sat in the quiet shop and looked at the small horse on the shelf and thought about patience and what it cost when you paid it out over something uncertain. Outside, the December wind was building across the sage flats, the specific cold of a Wyoming winter settling in for its long occupation of the valley. The town was bracing, the whole country was bracing. Out on the trail heading north, Kale Merritt was riding into it. The drive was everything he had wanted it to be, which meant it was brutal enough to occupy 14 hours of each 24, and exhausting enough to require the remaining 10 for sleep. The herd was large, more than 700 head of mixed cattle, and it moved with the mindless, cumulative momentum of a large herd, every animal contributing to the mass without any one of them appearing to understand what they were part of. He worked hard. Harder than the job required, because requiring the job to be harder gave his mind less surplus capacity to spend on things he had ridden 200 miles specifically not to think about. It did not work the way he had hoped. Harlan Beckett was a trail boss of the old school, built like weathered timber, with a face that 40 years of outdoor work had shaped into something that looked more like landscape than skin. He noticed things. He noticed Kale. 3 days out of Milhaven, Beckett pulled up alongside him on the flank of the herd and rode in silence for a while, the way a man who has something to see sometimes needs to ride alongside it first. "Good hand," Beckett said finally. "Thank you. Running from something or running to something?" Kale kept his eyes on the cattle. "Trail work," he said. Beckett made a sound adjacent to a laugh. "All right," he said, and pulled wide to check the drag. He did not push further. Kale gave him credit for this. The nights were the problem. The days had tasks, and tasks were the architecture that held everything else at a manageable distance. But at night, in the specific intimacy of a trail camp with the fire burned low and the herd breathing in the hollow below and the stars multiplying overhead until the sky seemed less like space and more like a ceiling pressing down, his mind went where it wanted to go. He thought about the livery in the late afternoon quiet, the particular quality of the winter light through the high windows. He thought about what that light did to the air in the room when she was standing in it, the steady brown of her eyes and the composed way she held herself. And he made himself stop thinking about it, because he was not going to be that man, lying in his bedroll on a December trail, cataloging the qualities of a woman's attention. He was going to be the man who had made a sensible decision to take some trail work, clear his thinking, and return to Milhaven in a few weeks with his reasoning restored and his walls repaired. This was the plan. On the 8th night, he was on second watch, riding the slow circle around the settled herd under a sky so cold and clear it seemed almost to ring, a sky you could nearly hear. He rode at a walk, the horse moving in the dark, the cattle breathing in the hollow, and then, without giving any instruction to do so, he stopped his horse. He sat in the stillness and looked out over the sage flats, spreading away in every direction, enormous and dark, empty, with an absoluteness that had no edge to it. The silence out here was the silence of a world that existed before human presence and would exist after it. It had no walls, no interior. It was the silence of actual emptiness. It was nothing like the silence of his cabin. He understood the difference in the same complete way he understood things, when understanding finally came, not gradually but all at once. The silence of the cabin was not empty. It was full of the specific contents of a life that had stopped, every object in absence, an uncrossed threshold speaking continuously of something that had been and was no longer. He had called it quiet, he had called it peace, he had called it sufficient. It was a prison he had built from grief and called a home. He sat his horse under the Montana stars and understood this without drama, without the collapse of anything dramatic, simply the recognition of a thing that had been true for some time before he had been willing to sit still long enough to look at it directly. He had not been protecting Rose by keeping her memory sealed inside that silence. He had been protecting himself from the effort of continuing. From the vulnerability of wanting something again that could be taken. Rose would have had very clear words for this. He turned his horse and rode back to camp. In the morning he found Beckett before the herd started moving. "I need to settle up," he said. "I'm heading back." Beckett looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen enough of the world to understand what he was looking at without needing it explained. "Running to something," he said, "not a question." "Yes," Kale said. Beckett counted his pay out of the trail box and handed it over. He looked at Kale for a moment more. "Don't waste the ride back," he said. Kale saddled his horse and turned south. He rode for 3 days. The Wyoming winter did not make accommodations for urgency. The same trail he had ridden north looked different from this direction, or he looked at it differently. The same sky, the same cold, the same long ridge lines. But something in the quality of his attention had shifted. The way light changes when a cloud moves off the sun and the landscape you thought you knew becomes suddenly specific. He rode and he thought, and for the first time in 3 years he let the thinking go where it needed to go without pulling it back. He thought about 3 years of Sunday mornings shaking out a white cloth and folding it back with the care of a man performing a sacred office. He thought about the single plate and the single cup and the cold hearth, and the way the cabin smelled of nothing, of absolute neutral absence, and how he had come to think of this as correctness. A life scaled to its actual contents. He thought about the bread, that smell filling the room, the way it did not belong there, and the way the not belonging of it had been precisely the thing that undid him. He thought about her hands on the rope, tying the trucker's hitch on the second attempt without any pretense about the first. The directness of her, the way she occupied space without requiring it to rearrange itself to accommodate her. The way she said the accurate thing and then walked away and let him carry it alone, which was, he understood now, the only way to offer such a thing to a man like him. You said it, and you stepped back, and you let him find his own way to it, and if he ran, you watched him go, and you placed the small horse where he would find it, and you waited to see what kind of man he turned out to be. On the second night, camped in the shelter of a limestone outcrop with his horse picketed and the fire small and the stars enormous, he thought about Rose. Not the way he had thought about her in the cabin, controlled re-entry into pain maintained at a specific managed depth, like a man going into cold water to prove he can bear it and coming out before he goes numb. He had never let himself simply sit with her memory the way you sat with a person in a room, without agenda, without the memory serving the purpose of the wall. He did it now. He thought about her as she had actually been. Rose, who had laughed too loud and burned the biscuits regularly and had strong opinions about the proper way to stack firewood and had told him exactly what she thought about everything before he had always finished asking. Rose, who had cried at the first snow every year, not from sadness but from some excess of feelings she could never quite account for. Rose, who had pressed her hand to her belly on an April afternoon and looked at him with an expression that had stopped his heart and restarted it at a different frequency. Rose, who had held his hand at the end and said his name and then had been gone. He sat with this beside the small fire and let it be what it was, not a wall, not a monument, not the justification for anything. Just a thing that had happened, the truest and most terrible thing that had ever happened to him, and also a thing that had already happened, that was finished, that existed now only in the permanent past where nothing could be added to it or taken from it. She was not preserved inside the silence of the cabin. The silence preserved nothing. It only emptied. He tended the fire, and somewhere in the long hours of the night he arrived at a different relationship with the weight he was carrying. Not resolution. Not the closure that people spoke of as though grief were a door that could be shut and latched. Simply a recognition that he was going to carry this weight. He was always going to carry it, but he did not have to organize his entire life around the carrying. He could carry it and still move. He arrived in Milhaven on the third afternoon, coming in from the north road with the winter sun already low, the town collecting the particular amber light of a Wyoming December late afternoon that made even ordinary boards look briefly, as though they had been built from something warmer than wood. He was covered in trail dust, and his horse needed water and feed, and he needed both of those things himself. But he did not go to the livery. He did not go to the cabin. He rode straight down the main street and tied his horse at the post in front of her shop and stood before the door with his hat in his hands. He could see her through the window. She was at the cutting table, bent over a length of dark fabric, her shears moving in the long certain strokes he recognized. The lamp was already lit against the early dark. The light of it caught the stray hairs at the back of her neck where they had worked loose from her braid over the course of the day. She had not seen him. He stood there longer than he intended. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way that was unusual and not entirely dignified for a man of his temperament. He put his hat back on. He took it off again. He opened the door. The small bell above it announced him. She looked up. Her hands went still on the fabric. She looked at him across the room, taking in the trail dust and the cold and the exhaustion written into his face, and her expression was not what he had expected. Not surprise, not relief, not the complicated reproach that he probably deserved. Simply her. That still, careful attention turned on him fully and without reservation. He closed the door behind him. The room was warm. She kept a good fire in the small stove in the corner, and the warmth of it came at him after 3 days of open trail cold like something physical, like the deliberate warmth of a room that had been tended by someone who intended it to be warm. He stood with his hat in his hands in the middle of her shop, and he did not know how to begin. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she set her shears down on the table with the same precise, unhurried movement she used for everything, and she looked at him. "You need to say something," she said. "So say it." He had assembled versions of this on the trail, over 3 days, and all of them had felt wrong in the way that true things sometimes felt wrong when forced into language. He had wanted something adequate to the size of what he meant, and he had not found it. He said what was true instead. "I've been using her memory as a reason not to live," he said. His voice was rough from trail dust and 3 days of saying almost nothing to anyone. "I told myself it was tribute, keeping the silence. Keeping everything the way it was." He stopped, started again. "It wasn't tribute. It was fear. I was afraid that if I let any of it change, she would be more gone than she already was." He looked down at the hat he was holding. "And I was afraid that if I let someone see me the way you kept trying to see me, I would have to admit that I was still here, still alive. And I had no particular plan to do anything useful with that." The room was very quiet. The stove ticked once in the cold. "Norah," he said, her name in his mouth for the first time, said the way you said something you had been careful not to say. "I don't know how to do this. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I rode 200 miles in the wrong direction before I understood what I was riding away from, and I have ridden 3 days back because I cannot think of a single good reason to be anywhere else." She looked at him for a long time. He waited. He was a man who understood waiting. He had stood outside a terrified horse's stall for 20 minutes once, not moving, not making a sound, simply present, until the horse had decided on its own terms that presence was not the same thing as threat. He could wait for whatever she needed. She moved toward the small stove in the corner of the room. "Sit down," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." He pulled out the chair at her work table and sat. He set the hat on the table. He felt his own relief as a physical thing, a releasing in his chest, not happiness exactly, but the sensation of something held too tightly for a very long time being allowed to ease. She filled the kettle from the pitcher on the shelf and set it on the stove. She did not look at him while she did this. She was not withholding. She was doing what she always did, occupying the practical actions of a moment while she let the larger things settle at their own pace. When the kettle was on, she turned and leaned against the wall beside the stove, her arms folded loosely. "I heard your horse on the street," she said. "Before dawn the morning you left. I knew you weren't going to the livery." A pause. "I didn't come to the window." He absorbed this. "Why not?" "Because if you had seen me, you might have stayed for the wrong reason." She said it simply, without reproach. "I didn't want that." "What did you want?" "I wanted you to go and come back," she said. "Or not come back, if that was the true thing. But to make the choice yourself, without me standing in the window making it harder to see clearly." The kettle began to murmur on the stove. Outside, the December wind was picking up along the main street, sending fine ice crystals ticking against the clean window glass. The lamp threw its warm circle, and on the shelf above the cutting table at the front edge where she had placed it on the first morning, the small wooden horse stood facing out into the room. He had not seen it until this moment. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You kept it," he said. "From the first morning." She glanced up at the shelf. "I put it there because I could see it from anywhere in the room." She looked back at him. "I didn't know if you were coming back. But the man who made that wasn't finished with things. I thought that was worth something." He stood up. It was not a plan. He stood up and crossed the room in 3 steps, and he took her right hand in both of his, the way you held something you had been looking for without knowing you were looking for it. She did not pull away. She looked up at him with that steady attention, and in it he could see what the months of this had cost her, the particular discipline of a person who had decided something was worth waiting for, and had waited for it without letting the waiting make her smaller. "I am sorry," he said, "for how I spoke to you, for leaving without a word, for every time I was unkind because being unkind was easier than being honest." "I know," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you'll have me, I know I've given you little reason to believe I'm capable of it." He paused. "But I intend to be here. Not the man I was before, Rose. I can't be him. A different man. One who has decided to be present." The kettle began to whistle. She looked at him for one more moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved in that way it moved when something was being held back that was not quite a smile but was its immediate precursor. "It took you long enough to get here, Kale Merritt," she said quietly. She turned to take the kettle off the stove. He stood in her warm shop with the trail dust still on his coat and his hat on the table and the small carved horse on the shelf above her work. And for the first time in 3 years, the air around him did not feel like it was pressing inward from every surface. It felt like a room, an ordinary warm room with a lamp and a stove and a woman making tea, and the December wind outside doing nothing more than reminding him of everything this room was not. He sat back down. They drank their tea. He told her about the drive, not the reasons for it, but the practical facts of it, the character of the country north of the valley, a near stampede at a creek crossing, the quality of the grazing. She listened and asked small intelligent questions. She told him about the town, the dress she was making for the banker's wife, the early freeze that had come on faster than anyone expected. It was the talk of neighbors, the ordinary exchange of two people catching each other up on the time they had been apart, but it felt like the most substantial conversation he had been part of in years. When the cups were empty, a different quality of silence came into the room. He set his cup down. He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who had spent his life working at things that required patience and precision. "I don't know how to do this easily," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to suddenly be a man who finds things easy." "I know," she said, "but I intend to be here." She nodded once, direct and unambiguous. "Then be here." He walked home that night in the cold December dark, and the mile between the town and the cabin was the same mile it had always been. Same frozen road, same sage flats, same indifferent stars, but he walked it differently. A man who had a direction he had chosen rather than one he had simply been continuing in by default. The following morning he went to his cabin. He had slept at the livery, in the small back room kept for late nights, and he had slept better than he had in weeks, which he noted without examining too carefully. He went home in the early morning, fed the stove, made coffee, and stood in the middle of the room looking at it with the particular attention of a man who has returned to a place after a sufficient absence to see it clearly. It was neat, it was clean, it was exactly as empty as he had made it. He looked at the chair. He set his coffee down on the table and walked to the corner by the window and stood before the chair with the white cotton cloth in his hands. Then, with a movement that was deliberate and unhurried, he pulled the cloth away. The dust motes rose in a slow spiral in the thin morning light, catching it and turning in it, small particles of what had been settled for a long time now adrift. He watched them rise and scatter and disappear into the general light of the room. The chair was pine, simple and patient, with a curved back and armrests worn smooth where hands had rested. Rose had chosen it from a furniture maker's catalog in Denver, and it had arrived on the spring stage the year before she died, and she had been so pleased with it that she had written the maker a letter to say so, which was the kind of person she had been. The wood was dry now, pale in places where the original finish had worn down to bare grain. He sat down in it. The chair received his weight with a small wooden sound of settling, a creak of adjustment. He sat in it and looked out the kitchen window at the sage flats and the mountain line beyond, and he let himself feel whatever was there to feel, which was several things at once, none of them simple. Grief was present. It was not the sharp, acute grief of the first year, but it was real and it was his, and he was done pretending otherwise, or building walls around it and calling the walls something else. Alongside it was something that did not yet have a name but felt like the first real morning after a long illness, the quality of air when you can breathe it without measuring each breath. He sat in the chair for a long time. Then he stood, put on his coat, went to the barn and found his tin of beeswax and the linseed oil. He spent the rest of the morning on the chair. He worked from the top down methodically, working the wax into the dry wood with a rag in small circular strokes until the pale, dusty surface began to deepen and warm. He was not erasing her. He understood this clearly as he worked. He was tending something she had loved, the way you tended a grave, not to obliterate what had happened there, but to mark that it still mattered, that the things that had happened in this place were not forgotten, only completed. The wood took the wax the way good dry wood takes it, gratefully, the grain coming up with a warmth that had been there all along, waiting for someone to tend it. He finished by mid-afternoon. The chair stood in the winter light, and it glowed with a honey warmth that it had not had in 3 years. It was the same chair. It was also different. It was a chair that had been tended rather than preserved, and those were not the same thing. He carried it out to the wagon and drove it into town. He carried it through the front door of her shop, which was open during working hours in the way she kept it, and he set it down beside her stove without saying anything first. She looked up from the dress she was pinning. She looked at the chair. She looked at him. "It was my wife's," he said. "I want it to be somewhere warm." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the chair beside her stove, the honey-warm pine of it against the dark iron, and something moved in her expression, a recognition of what he was giving her, which was not simply an object. She reached out and ran her palm slowly along the arm of it. "It's beautiful," she said. "She chose it," he said. "I just brought it back." The silence between them was not empty. It was the silence of two people who had understood something at the same time and did not need to describe it to each other. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, put his hat on, and went back out into the December street. He walked to his wagon with the particular gait of a man who has set something down and is recalibrating to the absence of its weight. He drove home. The cabin was different when he walked back in. Same boards, same windows, same cold hearth. But the corner by the window was just a corner now, just a space of floor and light and wall. He stood in the middle of the room, and the silence was just silence. Not a monument, not a prison, just the quiet of an ordinary room that needed a fire lit and a meal made and a man in it who had decided to live there. He lit the fire. He made his supper. He ate it at the table, and afterward he sat with his coffee and his thoughts, which were various and not unpleasant, and then he went to bed and slept a long, dreamless sleep through to the pale light of the next morning. 3 days after Kale returned, Gideon Price came to find him. He came to the livery in the mid-morning without announcement, walked in past the stable boys, and stopped in the center of the main aisle with his hat in his hands. Kale was working a knot out of a lead rope. He stopped and looked at Price. "You're back," Price said. 3 days. Price looked around the livery for a moment before he spoke. He looked at the horses in their stalls, the way they stood, the particular quality of quiet that existed in a space where animals had been handled with patience and consistency over a long time. He was a man who had spent his life reading landscapes and livestock, and he had developed a general competence at reading other things as well. "I asked Miss Voss to consider letting me call on her," he said, "while you were gone." He held Kale's gaze without aggression or apology, stating facts. She said she needed time to understand her situation. Kale set the lead rope down. "I know," he said. He had not known, but he understood what it meant. "I'm telling you because you should know," Price said. "Not because I'm stepping back. I don't step back from things that matter to me." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But I'm also not a man who wins by default. She deserves to be choosing between two real options, not between one man and an empty chair." He looked at Kale steadily. "So I'm telling you because if she's going to make a choice, I want it to be a real one." Made with clear eyes. Kale looked at him. He had expected to feel anger, or something like rivalry, the territorial response that the situation might have called for in another man. He felt instead something closer to respect, which was not what he had anticipated, and which he found he had no objection to. "That's fair," he said. "Good." Price put his hat back on. He looked at Kale for one more moment with those appraising eyes. "Don't take another cattle drive," he said. He walked out. Kale stood in the livery looking at the empty doorway. Then he turned back to his work. He did not take another cattle drive. He was at the church that Sunday for the first time in over a year, which produced among the congregation a reaction of carefully managed interest that was almost worth attending for on its own terms. He sat at the back. He stood when the congregation stood and sat when it sat, and the service moved over him in the way services did when the mind was elsewhere, and afterward he waited at the foot of the steps in the cold December air. She came through the door with her coat buttoned and her breath visible in the cold, and she saw him standing there and something happened in her face, brief and unguarded before her composure resolved it. But he had seen it. He walked her home. Side by side down the frozen street, their breath clouding in the air, their hands not touching, but the space between them different from what it had been before. She asked him about the country north of the valley, and he answered with more words than he generally used, and she received this without comment, as though it were simply what she had expected, and she was glad to have it confirmed. He walked her to her door. "Next Sunday," he said. "Next Sunday," she said. He walked back through the town with the cold coming down around him and the last of the December light going amber over the mountains, and the sage flats were the same sage flats they had always been, enormous and indifferent, but he moved through them differently. A man with a direction he had chosen. Their courtship was built the way they built everything, from small, genuine things accumulated over time. He walked her home from church on Sundays and stayed for coffee and an hour of conversation about horses and fabric and the town and the weather and the specific practical texture of the lives they were each making in this valley. On Thursdays he would find something left on his anvil, a jar of preserved pears, a square of apple cake wrapped in cloth, and he would find a reason the following day to pass her door and tell her that the pears were better than Henderson stocked, which was not high praise in absolute terms but was, coming from him, the genuine article. In February she repaired 2 loose buttons on his work coat without being asked, having noticed them the previous Sunday, and handed it back to him without ceremony. He thanked her and she waved the thanks away, and they both understood that this was what it looked like when two people tended to each other. The quiet, ordinary accretion of small noticed things. In March the bay gelding was ready. Kale had known it for several days before he did anything about it. On a Tuesday afternoon when the sky had come back pale blue after a week of overcast, and the first real warmth was starting to make itself felt in the air, he took the bay out into the corral and worked him on the lunge line for 20 minutes, and the horse moved with a liquid ground-eating ease that was the visible form of everything the past 5 months had built. No skitter, no white-rimmed eye, just the clean movement of an animal that had been given enough time and consistency to understand that the world was not always the thing that had frightened it before. Kale brought him to a stand at the center of the corral and put his hand on the horse's neck and felt the even, quiet pulse there. He went to her shop that afternoon and knocked, which he had not done before, and when she opened the door, he said, "Come and see." She came. She stood at the corral fence and watched the bay move, and the bay, who had been watching her since she appeared, came to the fence of his own choosing and put his nose against her outstretched hand. Warm breath on cold fingers. "He's wonderful," she said. "He just needed time," Kale said. She looked at him and he held her gaze, and they both understood they were talking about more than the horse. He asked her to marry him that evening. They were sitting on the steps of her shop in the March cold with the last daylight fading over the mountains, and it was not a prepared speech. It was simply the moment, and he said what was true, that he wanted to build a life with her, a real one that moved forward, that carried the past with it, but was not defined entirely by the past. He said it simply, and he meant every word of it, and he did not dress it up with anything it did not need. She said yes in the same tone she used for everything, clear and direct and without embellishment, as though it were the obvious conclusion of a proposition they had both been examining from different angles for some time and had now arrived at together. They were married the following May, when the wild crocuses were coming through the last of the snowmelt, and the cottonwoods along the creek had that particular yellow-green of the very first leaves before they darkened into summer. The whole of Milhaven came to the church, which surprised Kale and did not appear to surprise Norah at all. She wore a dress of pale blue calico she had made herself, fitted at the waist with a collar of white eyelet ordered from Denver. He wore the suit that had hung in the back of the wardrobe for 3 years, and it fit him adequately, which was enough. He stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle, and the feeling in his chest was not a simple thing. It was layered, the way most true feelings are layered, and one of the layers was grief, quiet and permanent, and he did not try to push that layer down or pretend it was not there. It belonged there. It was part of what he had brought to this moment and would bring to all the moments after it. But the layer above it, the thing his face was doing in a way he could feel it doing, was something he had not expected to feel again, something he had not been entirely certain he was still capable of. She reached him at the front of the church and looked up at him, and she was not surprised by what she saw in his face, because she had never appeared to be surprised by things she had understood for some time. The preacher said the words. Kale said the words. Norah said the words. Outside, the May sky was the particular blue that appeared in Wyoming in the exact moment when winter finally relented completely. A blue that was not just the absence of clouds, but the presence of something, warmth and length of days and the particular quality of light that the valley would hold for the next 4 months. 5 years passed. They passed the way good years pass in a country that does not forgive carelessness, not without difficulty and not without the ordinary adjustments and compromises of two people building a life in a place that demanded their best effort most days, but with a steadiness and competence that were the natural expression of who they both were. The cabin grew. A new wing was added the second summer, and a wide porch across the front that caught the morning light and held it. The livery work expanded when the previous owner retired and passed the operation to Kale on terms generous enough to suggest he had been waiting for the right person to leave it to. The land around the cabin acquired a barn, solid and well-built, and fences running out in clean lines across the sage, enclosing a pasture where a small herd of selected horses grazed with the ease of animals that had been handled well. The Sorrel Mare was among them. He had found her at a spring auction in their second year, recognized immediately in her bearing the animal his hands had made from the pale block of cottonwood, the gentle, alert posture, the self-possessed quality of stillness, and he had brought her home. She had been everything he expected. There were children. A boy first, 4 years old now in the summer of 1889, with Kale's gray eyes and Norah's determined chin and an absolute attachment to the small wooden horse that he had discovered among his mother's things at the age of 2 and had refused to be separated from since. A girl after him, 2 years old, with a vocabulary that was developing well past what her size suggested was possible and an opinion about most things, which surprised nobody who knew her mother. On a summer evening in 1889, the sun was doing what the summer sun did in Wyoming, taking its time with the going of it, laying the light across the mountains in long, slow strokes of amber and deep rose and the particular violet that came just before the dark. Kale was sitting on the top step of the porch with a piece of harness leather in his hands, working on a repair that did not urgently need doing that evening, but that gave his hands something to do while the rest of him was still. He heard the door open behind him, and the smell of coffee came ahead of her as it always did, and she settled beside him on the step and handed him a cup and sat with her shoulder against his, in the easy way they had developed over 5 years of shoulders, being against each other in various configurations through various seasons. Out in the new grass of the yard, the children were engaged in some enterprise that involved considerable directional disagreement. The boy had the small wooden horse raised in his fist and was making it gallop in wide arcs through the summer air, narrating its journey in the continuous murmur of a child entirely absorbed in his own story. The girl was conducting a separate and apparently equally important project involving a stick and a collection of rocks she was arranging according to a system of her own design. "He never goes anywhere without it," Norah said, watching the boy. "Good instincts," Kale said. She turned to look at him, and he could see in the corner of her mouth the precursor to a smile. The small movement he had learned to read in the months before the smile itself had become something he was permitted to see clearly. He looked at his son, the small carved shape moving through the summer air with the ease of something that had always been exactly what it was. He thought about a November evening in a lamp-lit cabin, a block of pale cottonwood and a knife and his hands moving without instruction, making something for someone before he had understood that was what they were doing. "You were right," he said. She looked at him. "About what?" "That day in the livery," he said. He kept his eyes on the children. "The first time." She was quiet for a moment, waiting. "I could have used some company," he said. She was quiet a moment more. "You still can," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat together on the steps of the home he had built for a life that had ended, and then rebuilt for a life that had not, watching their children move through the summer grass in the long Wyoming evening. His son brought the wooden horse in for a landing on his knee, the final dramatic move of whatever story had been unfolding, and the girl looked up from her rocks and said something authoritative that her brother received with the resigned expression of a child, learning that certain voices simply carried more weight than others regardless of volume. The mountains went from amber to rose to the soft blue-gray of deep evening. The first nighthawks appeared over the sage, dipping and turning in the warm air. Down along the creek, a night bird called once and was answered by another somewhere in the cottonwoods. Kale sat on the steps of this porch, on this land with this woman beside him, and he thought about the nature of what he had almost refused. He could see it clearly now, with the clarity that only distance and time made possible, the way you could see a landscape you had been inside, only from a sufficient height above it. A man standing in a room he had emptied and locked from the inside, calling the emptiness peace, calling the lock a tribute to someone who would not have wanted it. What it had been was fear, plain and simple and human, the fear of wanting something again that could be lost. And what Norah had done, with her bread left on an anvil, and her accurate observations offered, and her small horse kept on the shelf at eye level every day, with her patience that had never tipped into pressure and her willingness to watch him go without coming to the window, was simply to stand outside the door. Not knocking, not calling to him, not demanding or pleading or performing the kind of patience that is actually a form of pressure. Just present, in the quiet way she was present, unhurried and genuine, waiting for him to find the courage to open the door himself, on his own terms, in his own time. He thought about what that had cost her. The specific discipline of caring for someone who was doing his level best to make caring for him unreasonable. She had never let him see the cost, which was either generosity or wisdom, and was probably both. He looked at her in the evening light, the straight line of her nose, the calm deliberateness of her face even in repose. The gray that had started at her temples 2 years earlier than most women her age, and which she had received with the same absence of drama she brought to most things. "I'm glad you kept the horse," he said. She looked at him. Then through the open door at the shelf above the cutting table she still kept in the main room of the house, because she still made things in the evenings by lamplight just as she always had. The small carved mare was still there, at the front of the highest shelf where she had placed it on the first morning. It had not occurred to either of them to move it. "So am I," she said. The boy had settled in the grass now, lying on his back with the wooden horse resting on his chest, looking up at the first stars appearing in the deep blue above the mountains. His sister migrated from her rocks to lean against his shoulder, tilting her face up with the same expression of open, complete attention she brought to anything that seemed worth looking at carefully. The mountains finished their slow passage through the colors of evening and settled into the blue-gray of full dark. The nighthawks worked the air above the sage. The horses in the pasture moved in their quiet way, their shapes dark against the last light on the grass. Kale sat on the steps of his home with his arm around the woman who had stood outside his door and waited, and he understood with the particular completeness of things that have been understood gradually and then all at once, what he had been given. Not rescued, not fixed, not pulled from the room he had built, simply accompanied patiently and without condition to the point where he could find the door himself. He thought about what it meant, the love that did not arrive as a flood or a fire or a sudden dramatic alteration of the landscape of a life, but as water finding its level. Patient, without force. moving not by declaration or grand gesture but by the steady, faithful pressure of persistence, finding the cracks in a hard-packed thing and softening them so gradually you could not have said precisely when the change had happened. Only that one morning the ground that had been closed was open, and the thing that had been dry was no longer dry. It was the love that began with a blanket carried to a livery on a pretended errand, and a loaf of bread refused and eaten alone in the dark, and a small horse carved from a piece of pale cottonwood by hands that knew what they were doing before the mind that owned them had caught up to the understanding of it. It was the love built from accurate sentences offered without demand, from things left on a workbench without waiting for thanks, from a window not looked out of on a December morning when looking would have been the wrong kind of help, from a horse kept on a shelf at eye level every single day, because the man who made it was not finished with things, and that was worth something, and she had known it was worth something from the first morning she held it in her hands. It was the kind of love that did not require a man to be different from what he was, only to be willing to remain present to what he could become. It was the kind that lasted.